Everybody, welcome to class today. We're going to try this. Last time I tried this when I wasn't able to be in class, I tried posting on YouTube and it would not post. YouTube had it taken down. So we're going to see if we can't get this to work any better. And if it doesn't work any better, then I'll have to either email it to you guys individually, or if that doesn't work, you'll just have to do the reading yourself and I'll email you guys the slides. Hopefully one of those things will work, but we'll see. So go ahead and take your books and go to page number 353. Now, the slides from last week that you didn't have, I will make sure you get them at some point. I'm going to try to get them to you this week. That might not happen. If that doesn't happen, don't worry. I'm going to make sure you have it by the time we have our test. And as for testing, I'm not sure how we're going to do it, but we're going to do it somehow. So just make sure that you be prepared for me to tell you that. But until then, don't worry. I'll make sure you have everything you need for the test. You'll not have anything to worry about. Okay, so you should have your place on page number 353 now. You finished off last week reading about the changes that were taking place in Europe. We saw things about the English Civil War with Cavaliers and the Roundheads under Charles I, James I. We saw the absolutism that took place in England. Today we're going to move out of England. We're going to move into the rest of the European monarchies at the time. What we have first is what takes place in Spain and in the subsequent places. Before we get to that, you need to write a term down that's going to explain all of Europe during the 18th century. You look at the European continent in the 18th century, and one term is the best way to describe what's going on, and that's what this next slide is. That phrase is called the balance of power. This is chapter 13, page 353, and our assignment for today is page 353 to 359. A balance of power. Now you see right here on the picture, the image right here of a balance. When we think of a balance, or at least when I do, let me tell you what I think about. I think about Daniel chapter 5. In Daniel chapter 5 in the Bible, the king of Babylon is having a feast when the hand of God comes and begins to write on the wall, many, many tekel upharsin, which means you have been found in the balance and been found wanting. Daniel translates that to mean, okay, Mr. King of Babylon, God has a balance. Your good works versus your bad works. And your good works, and again, when I say good works, I don't mean in terms of salvation. That's not what I'm talking about. But the good works of what you have done on the earth is not enough to overlook all of the bad things. Again, I'm not talking about salvation. I'm talking about how Babylon had become a seat of much sin, and it had to be overthrown if justice was going to take place on God's understanding. So what God did was he sent that warning to said, listen, your good works do not outweigh your bad works. You've still been found wanting, and judgment is coming. Now what we see in Europe, this balance of power takes place, and all of these nations are beginning to coalesce in groups. The definition of balance of power is like this. It's the forming of an alliance to ensure that no one nation would dominate the other. You look at a picture of Europe during that time. Again, Europe is the center of the world powers. There is no world power really outside of Europe. You had England, you had France, you had Spain. All of these were nations that were the most powerful in the world. And when you have all of these different powerful nations packed into this small area we know as the European continent, people are going to not trust each other. And so alliances began to form between different nations that allowed for one country to say, okay, if this one country becomes too bellicose in their actions, you and I are going to sign together, and we're going to try to prevent their expansion. So what happens is all of these nations begin to coalesce and to form alliances. And one of the most important times that these alliances were built was during what's called the War of Spanish Succession. The War of Spanish Succession, this is a big example of a huge balance of power. During the balance of power, during this War of Spanish Succession, you had the French and the English on one side. The French and the English going to war with each other. And you had the Prussians and the Austrians going to war with each other. And they ended up uniting against a common enemy. So let's look at this. During the 18th century, Prussia. Now you see on the note right down here, Prussia is on the bottom left corner. Prussia remained the constant foe of both Austria and France during the 18th century. And so what happens is Prussia began allying themselves with Britain. And what happens is France and Austria begin to go to war with each other. Now, why do these nations begin to go to war with each other? What is the powder keg that gets this all started? Well, in the 1700s, there was a king of Spain, and the king of Spain was a part of the Habsburg line. Now, if you don't remember what we talked about the Habsburg line is basically the Austrian line. So there is a sense that when the king of Spain dies, who is going to take control? Is it going to be the nation to which the Habsburg line attributes to? Or is it going to be France? Because what happens, and you see this on page 353, this Habsburg king of Spain actually doesn't leave the king of Spain to someone in the Habsburg line. He leaves the throne to his young grandnephew Philip, who was a grandson of Louis XIV, who is a French. So you've got a Habsburg king that instead of sending the throne down his people's way, he appoints his grandnephew, who is a Frenchman, on the throne. Now, obviously, you can imagine the Austrians are not going to be happy with that. So they're going to try to gain control of the French or of the Spanish throne. Well, France has an interest here, because if France can take control of the Spanish throne, then you're going to have a uniting of those two nations. Remember several chapters ago when we talked about how Castile and Aragon formed the nation of Spain? Well, basically what you have here is the potential for Spain and France to unite. And that is a uniting of huge powerhouses. Those two nations will basically take control of all of Europe if they're allowed to continue. So obviously, Prussia and England are not going to let that happen. So Prussia and England unite to try to fight against France and Austria to try to keep control of these to make sure everybody stays in their own neutral corners and no one nation becomes sovereign over all of Europe. This is what's called as the Grand Alliance. Now, the three major wars of this period was evidence of this balance of power. So 3 wars were fought during the 18th century, and they were all fought between this alliance here, the Grand Alliance. It was all fought over this. Now, this war eventually came to an end, and when this war came to an end, it came to an end with several agreements that would absolutely change Europe forever. One of the agreements was this: in order for the War of Spanish Succession to come to an end, number one, well, let me go back here because you were supposed to have that written down and I didn't go far enough. So while you're writing this down about the Grand Alliance, I'll go ahead and read off of page 354 what happens next. The War of Spanish Succession ended in 1713, and what stopped the war was something called the Treaty of Utrecht. Now, the Treaty of Utrecht included a lot of provisions, and the Treaty of Utrecht included these 3 things. The first thing was Philip of France, the guy who had been appointed by the Habsburg king that died. Philip was allowed to keep the throne of Spain as long as the crowns of France and Spain were not united. So Spain and France need to stay separate countries. They're not going to unite under one king. The second thing is Spain had to surrender all of her possessions in the Netherlands and in the Mediterranean Sea to Austria. Now, you can look at this map and you can see where the Mediterranean Sea is. The Netherlands are up here right up north of, just underneath Denmark. And so Spain had to surrender some of those holdings. And then finally, Britain won various Canadian territories. Because remember, at this time, Britain didn't have control of Canada. And so one of the things is they gained some Canadian territories. Now, that would end up changing a lot in the coming years, because then you'll have another war in which Britain was able to retain all of Canada. But I don't want to skip ahead for that. So go ahead and pause this and write down these notes. I know there's a lot more notes on these. That's simply because we're not in class and I have to make sure you have everything. So go ahead and pause here and finish writing this down, and then unpause the video and we'll continue on. Okay, you should already have this all written down, so we'll continue on. The next thing, now one of the things, okay, when you go to you go to a meeting, one of the first things you find out for instance, and I don't know this from experience, obviously, this is, one of the popular sayings is at an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, one of the most common phrases is, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is the definition of madness. You do the same thing over and over again and it doesn't change anything. You always end up having the same reaction. Well, what happens next is there's going to be another war. It's not going to be for Spanish succession. This is going to be Austrian succession. I'm reminded of a quote that says, all old news is new news just happening to new people. And that's basically what happens. You thought that the wars of successions ended after the Spanish War of Succession. Nope, you got another one coming on here. And this one is the war for Austrian succession. Now, what happens here is in 1713, the Emperor of Austria, his name was Charles VI. He drew up a piece of paper called the Pragmatic Sanction. Now, what happened is this. The Pragmatic Sanction, Charles VI was scared, because his only heir was a girl, and he was scared that this baby girl was going to come to the throne of Austria. And because she was the only female monarch in Europe at the time, he was concerned that the other nations were going to try to take advantage of her and try to take Austrian land. Well, he came up with this thing. It's called the Pragmatic Sanction. In theory, the Pragmatic Sanction was supposed to allow, and I just now noticed I misspelled neighbors, my bad. The Pragmatic Sanction was supposed to keep Austria's neighbors from encroaching upon borders once Maria Theresa became Empress of Austria. The whole idea is, when Charles VI dies, no one's going to be around to protect Maria Theresa. So what he does is he signs this thing and says, okay, you guys cannot encroach upon my land when my daughter is Empress. That went over about as well as you would expect it to. Did not go over well. It went over like a lead balloon. Because when it's a war of who gets what land, guess what? It doesn't matter what paper you're signed. Because people want more land, especially in this time period. So after Charles VI dies, Maria Theresa comes to the throne. And what happens is Frederick II of Prussia. Now, Prussia is going to get very, very important in the future. Now, what is Prussia? Prussia, a lot of the Prussian states basically comprise of modern-day Germany. Because remember, the Holy Roman Empire is pretty much ended at this point, which was basically Germany. The Holy Roman Empire is kind of done with. All that's left now is you've got all these independent Germanic or German states. Prussia is the most important of them, and Prussia is very, very militaristic. They want to gain more land. So Frederick II comes to the throne, and he desired the rich mining areas of a city called Silesia, which belonged to Austria. So he decided once Charles VI died, forget what his father and he signed at the Pragmatic Sanction. He was going to go to war with Maria Theresa, the Empress of Austria, for that land. She had only been Empress for 2 months, and she's already being thrown into the fire, so to speak. And Frederick decides to invade that province to get Silesia from the Austrians. Now, this ended up resulting in a huge war throughout Europe, because it wasn't going to be just Austria and Prussia in this. There would be Spain would enter into the war. Italy was going to end up in the war in some way, shapes, or form. Britain was going to end up in it. There was a lot of problems here, and it pretty much divides Europe for many years. Now, the war did finally end when they all signed the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. Now remember, we talked about Aix-la-Chapelle when we were going through the feudal age. But this is the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle ended the war, and right after that, you got another war that took place, and it's the